The night he walked into that small roadside diner, nothing about Ethan Ward fit the place. He carried the weight of a name that turned heads in boardrooms, yet here he was, slipping quietly into a booth, hoping nobody noticed the billionaire ordering the cheapest meal on the menu. That choice alone would have confused anyone watching, but he wanted it that way, wanted to disappear behind plain walls and warm lights that felt nothing like the cold stone of his world. The crew waited outside with their cameras packed away, expecting him to record a few harmless moments for the documentary that was supposed to show how well he understood ordinary life. But he didn't lift his phone. He only watched the counter, watched the door swing open and shut as strangers came and went, each carrying something he couldn't put into words. When Mia started walking toward him with a calm smile he didn't expect, a strange pressure tightened in his chest, as if that small kindness aimed at a man she didn't know could split open something he had spent years trying to protect. What made her look at him that way, and why did the crew wait with such quiet tension, as if something bigger than a cheap meal was about to happen? Ethan had lived most of his life behind polished glass, where people greeted him with respect, but never with warmth. Every handshake felt like an agreement, not a greeting, every smile a strategy, not a feeling. His empire brought him numbers and praise, but never closeness, and somewhere along the line he simply accepted the empty space inside him as part of the price of success. The documentary had been the board's idea, a chance to soften his image by placing him near everyday people. He agreed because it sounded simple, almost forgettable, just another project to move through. Sitting stiffly in the diner, he expected nothing more than a quiet hour, followed by another quick stop on the schedule. But when Mia came back with a slow, steady way of speaking, and gently asked if he wanted his coffee topped off the same way as before, something pushed through that emptiness. She had memorized that small detail without effort, and he couldn't remember the last time someone noticed anything about him that wasn't tied to money or status. The thought lingered in his mind, pulling him towards something he didn't yet understand, and he waited for her to return again just to see what else she would notice. When Mia set the plate down and called him friend, the word hit him with surprising force. It wasn't the polite term people used in meetings when they wanted something. It was soft and real, carrying no agenda at all. Ethan's breath caught for a second, as if he had forgotten how to respond to anything that didn't come with conditions. Her smile didn't linger out of obligation, and her movements weren't rushed or calculated. She treated everyone with that quiet sincerity, noticing who needed extra napkins or which regular liked extra pepper on his eggs. Ethan watched her greet an older couple, comfort a stressed mother with a toddler, and offer warmth with the ease of someone who still believed people deserved it. He realized his chest felt tight, not from discomfort, but from longing, a longing he had ignored so long he didn't recognize it until now. Why did this simple moment matter? Why did one gentle word carry more weight than the awards lined on his office walls? For the first time in years, he didn't want to rush to the next meeting or hide behind work. He wanted to stay, to understand why this stranger made him feel something he had forgotten existed. Harper pushed through the door with the restless energy of someone whose schedule ruled every minute of life, reminding Ethan that the crew needed to move on. But Ethan barely heard her. His attention stayed on Mia, on the way she mentioned her father's long shifts and her sister's school plans, while brushing off her own dreams as if they were old clothes she packed away years ago. Each sentence she spoke revealed more of a story shaped by sacrifice, not lack of ambition. Ethan felt a pull he didn't know how to name, something that tugged at the emptiness he carried like a shadow. Harper whispered that the board wouldn't be pleased if he delayed the project, and the tension in her voice sharpened. This diner wasn't on the schedule, and staying here would send the wrong message. But Ethan realized the schedule wasn't what mattered anymore. Something about Mia's quiet resilience and those small, thoughtful gestures made him question everything he had built. The pressure around him grew heavier as Harper insisted they leave, yet Ethan felt a stirring inside him, a small heartbeat returning, pushing him to stay even if it meant conflict waiting on the other side of that diner door. When Ethan finally stood up, Harper expected him to follow her back to the car, but he surprised them both by saying he was done with the documentary. He didn't raise his voice or offer excuses. He simply said he couldn't keep doing something that felt empty. He sat back down in the booth, staring at the untouched footage on his phone, realizing he didn't recognize the man in those clips anymore. The diner around him hummed with small conversations and clinking dishes, and for the first time in his adult life, He felt like the world inside that booth was more honest than anything waiting for him in his high-rise office. Defiance slid through him, mixed with fear of what his board would do when they heard. Yet beneath that fear was a strange sense of relief, like he had taken the first real breath in years. He glanced toward Mia again, wondering how someone could carry so many forgotten dreams, yet still offer kindness so freely. Whatever was happening inside him wasn't something he could ignore, and he knew this moment marked a turn he couldn't undo. He needed to understand the life she lived, and maybe discover the part of himself he had lost long before stepping into that diner. Before we jump in, take a quick second to pause the video and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, or if you've ever met someone whose kindness stayed in your mind for years. Go ahead and drop that comment now, because it helps keep this story going, and it fits perfectly with what Ethan is about to feel next. Thank you for doing that. Now let's get back to him walking through that diner door again the very next morning, as if something inside him refused to let the night before fade away. Ethan came back without any cameras, without Harper, without the weight of the documentary on his shoulders. He sat at the same booth, feeling strangely unsure of himself, almost like someone sneaking into a world he wasn't sure he deserved to be part of. Mia noticed him right away and walked over with that same warm spark in her eyes, the kind that didn't shrink just because someone looked tired or lost. She joked gently that she expected him to be on the road already, and he admitted he just wanted breakfast. But the truth was sitting deeper than those simple words. He wanted to understand why her kindness still echoed in his chest long after he left, why one small moment had cracked open something he forgot he had. As she refilled his cup, he asked how long she'd been working there, and the answer carried a heavier story than he expected. Mia talked about double shifts, bills piling up, and her father's old injuries that kept him from the long hours he used to work. She mentioned her younger sister, bright and stubborn, who still believed in big dreams, even when the family could barely keep up with daily life. Ethan listened in a way that felt new to him. In board meetings, he waited for openings to speak, but here he found himself simply taking in every word she shared. He tried offering help without making it sound like a favor, just gentle ideas about easing her load, but she turned them down with a thankful smile, saying some things people had to carry themselves. Her answer humbled him, made him feel small in a good way, like he was learning something important he should have known long ago. He watched her move around the diner with a calm strength he admired more than he ever admired ambition in the rooms he ruled. The conversation circled back to her sister again, then to her dad, then to how the diner treated her like family on the days she barely held it together. Ethan felt a quiet warmth rising inside him, like someone lighting a small lamp in a dark hallway he'd forgotten existed. He realized he was leaning forward, studying her face, trying to understand how someone who held so much weight could still offer kindness that felt effortless. Mia brushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear and mentioned she once thought her life would turn out different. She said it casually, almost laughing it off, but Ethan caught the shift in her voice, a tiny break, a note of something lost. When he gently asked what she meant, she looked down at the plates she was carrying and admitted she once dreamed of becoming a teacher. She said it quietly, like the memory was something precious she kept hidden, and the softness in her voice made Ethan feel something tighten again in his chest. It was the same feeling from the night before, but now it carried a sharper ache, as if he was being shown a truth he couldn't ignore. He asked her what stopped her, but someone called for her from the counter and she excused herself with a smile that tried to hide the disappointment slipping through. Ethan watched her walk away, realizing she wasn't someone who had given up. She was someone who had been forced to carry responsibilities that had no room for dreams. He sat there thinking about how many people he met in his empire, people with resumes as straight as steel, who had never shown him anything close to the honesty Mia had revealed in a single morning. The diner hummed around him, but his thoughts grew heavier with each passing second. He realized he didn't want to leave this place without understanding what had blocked her path, what had taken that dream from her hands. And the feeling wasn't the cold curiosity of a businessman gathering data. It was personal, warm, and strangely urgent, like her story was pulling him toward a part of himself he had neglected for far too long. That desire settled deep within him, steady and undeniable, and he knew coming back tomorrow wouldn't feel strange at all. By the time he paid for his meal, he wasn't thinking about Harper or the board or the project he had walked away from. He was thinking about Mia's quiet smile, about the weight behind her words, about the way she said she once wanted to teach with a softness that felt almost sacred. He stepped outside into the morning sun, with that single question echoing through him louder than the noise of passing cars. What had taken that dream from her? Why did she believe it was no longer hers to hold? Those questions followed him all the way to his car, settling into him with a force that told him his next steps would carry him deeper into her world than he ever expected. And he didn't feel afraid of that. He felt ready to know more, ready to listen in a way he'd never listened to anyone before, ready for whatever truth waited for him the next time he sat in that booth and looked into her eyes. Ethan showed up again before the breakfast rush, trying to act like it was normal for him to walk into a place like that 2 days in a row, but even he knew he wasn't fooling anyone. He settled into the same booth, waiting for Mia, but instead, Ray stepped out from behind the counter, wiping his hands on a towel. The cook had that steady way about him, like someone who'd learned to take life one long shift at a time. He nodded at Ethan and said Mia was running late because her dad had a rough night. Ethan felt a small pinch of worry for reasons he didn't want to admit out loud, so he asked if everything was okay. Ray gave him a look that wasn't rude, just honest, the kind of look people give when they're deciding whether someone deserves the truth. Then he sat across from Ethan without being invited and said Mia carried more weight than she ever let show. He talked about her mom getting sick during her last year of high school and how Mia dropped everything, even a college acceptance she'd been proud of, to work full-time and pay medical bills. The words settled on Ethan like a heavy coat. Something in his chest tightened as he pictured Mia shelving her dream without bitterness, still choosing to treat people with a softness she never received back. He didn't know how to respond, so he just listened, trying to understand the quiet strength behind the gentle smile she wore. When Mia finally walked in with an apologetic grin and a tired wave, Ethan felt something warm rise through him, something close to gratitude for simply seeing her safe. She joked about oversleeping, and Ray cut in with a playful roll of his eyes, telling her not to lie to their guest. Mia shot him a glare, but there was no anger, only the kind of family bond built through shared struggle. Ethan saw the truth settle between them without needing more words. When Mia came to his table, he asked softly if her dad was doing better, and she paused, surprised he cared enough to remember. She thanked him, explaining her father had rough nights sometimes, but she was used to it. Ethan told her nobody should have to be used to that much weight, and she smiled in that gentle way that always hit deeper than he expected. That smile held a whole history of carrying others first and herself last. He wanted to lighten something for her, even if he didn't know how yet. Then her phone buzzed with Ethan's company name glowing across the screen, but it was his phone, not hers. The board was calling again. He watched it ring and chose to ignore it for the first time since he started the empire. Mia caught the look on his face and asked if he needed to take it, and he shook his head, telling her he didn't want to miss the moment. She didn't know what that meant, but she thanked him anyway for being present. Hearing that word from her lips made something inside him shift again, like he was stepping out of the role he'd played for too long and into something real. She wiped down the table and asked if he ever wished he'd done something else before life got busy. The question hit him harder than she knew. He admitted he had spent so long chasing the next achievement that he never stopped to ask himself what he actually wanted. For the first time he said it out loud, and she listened with the same care she offered strangers who needed comfort. That simple act made him feel more seen than any award ceremony he had ever attended. Moments like that are the ones people hold on to, the ones where somebody listens not because they gain anything, but because they understand how heavy a dream can be when it's pushed aside. Anyone hearing this now knows how rare that kind of connection is, and how powerful it feels when a simple conversation makes someone rethink their entire life. It's the kind of moment that reminds all of us how much these small exchanges matter, and why telling our own stories helps others feel less alone. This is the part where listeners in different places might feel that same pull, thinking of the people who changed them with just a sentence or a moment of kindness. Harper arrived right as Mia walked away to help another customer. She appeared in the doorway with a tight jaw and a colder tone than usual, saying Ethan needed to talk outside. When he stepped out with her, she wasted no time telling him the board was preparing a formal reprimand. They didn't understand why he abandoned the documentary, why he ignored their calls, why he was wasting time in a diner when the company needed him. Harper asked what he was doing, and for once Ethan had no polished answer. Instead, he said he was learning things he should have learned years ago. Harper warned him that the board wasn't playing around and that he was risking everything he built. He looked back at the diner window where Mia laughed softly with a regular customer, and he felt the choice rising inside him, like a tide he couldn't push back. He stood there in the cool morning air, realizing he had reached a point where he needed to decide what kind of man he wanted to be from here on out. The weight of that decision settled around him, and he knew whatever came next would change far more than his work schedule. Ethan waited until the lunch crowd thinned before saying what had been building inside him since the moment he first heard her story. Mia wiped down the table with that calm rhythm she always had, and he tried to find the right words, ones that didn't sound like pity or some rich man's attempt to fix everything with a check. He told her she deserved more than double shifts and nights spent carrying everyone else's weight. She laughed a soft, tired laugh that made his stomach twist because it didn't come from amusement. It came from someone who learned long ago that life rarely gives back what it takes. She said people like her don't get more, that dreams were things you set aside once real life showed up. Ethan felt the words hit him like a blow, sharper than anything the board had ever thrown at him. Hearing her say that out loud made him realize how heavy the world could be for people who never had a choice. She didn't say it with bitterness, just acceptance, and somehow that was worse. He stared at her, feeling something break open inside him, something he'd kept locked away behind success and cold boardrooms. She smiled as if trying to soften the moment, but the crack in her voice told him the truth sat deeper than she ever meant to reveal. He stepped outside before the pressure in his chest pulled him apart. The cool air didn't calm him, it only made the ache clearer. He walked toward the edge of the parking lot, hands shaking, overwhelmed by the idea that all his wealth meant nothing if someone like Mia believed there was no path forward for her. He felt the kind of heartbreak he didn't know how to name, not romantic or dramatic, but the heartbreak of witnessing someone's spirit pressed down until it believed it had no sky left. He leaned against his car and let his breath shake free, not caring if anyone saw him. The life he had built, the empire he protected, suddenly looked hollow next to one woman's lost dream. He saw flashes of board meetings, polished speeches, charity events, where he never touched the lives he claimed to help. Those scenes blended with Mia standing under the diner lights, quietly carrying her family, while letting her own future fade. The contrast was too sharp to ignore, too cruel to accept. When he finally walked back inside, Mia greeted him with that same soft smile, pretending nothing heavy had passed between them. He felt a new understanding rising in him, an awareness of how much people carry without ever asking for help. He apologized if he had made her uncomfortable earlier, and she told him he hadn't, that she appreciated someone caring enough to say she deserved more. That gratitude struck him deeper than he expected. She didn't blame him for anything. She didn't resent him for his life. She simply believed hers was already decided. Ethan felt something settle inside him then, not a sad weight this time, but a firm, steady sense of responsibility. Not the responsibility he felt toward shareholders or public image, but toward people like her, people who kept the world running while believing their dreams didn't matter. Decisions like this, the ones that start quietly in the heart, never stay small. They grow into something that changes the shape of everything around them, and even if Ethan didn't see it yet, the choice forming in him would come back with a force he couldn't imagine. Every step he took from this moment would build toward something larger, something waiting just ahead that would test everything he thought he knew. He sat across from her again, really looking at her for the first time without the filter of curiosity or the need to study her life for a project. He asked her what she would teach if she could go back to school, and the way her eyes lit up for half a second broke him all over again. She said she always loved helping kids who struggled, kids who felt behind. She wanted to be the kind of teacher who saw the student everyone else overlooked. Ethan realized she was already that kind of person, just without the classroom. He felt a calm decision rising through him, one sharper than fear. He would help her and others like her, not by filming them or using their stories, but by giving them real chances. No cameras, no public announcements, no polished speeches. Something honest, something human, something that mattered. A small silence hung between them as she looked at her phone and walked away to check on her dad. Ethan watched her go and felt the path ahead of him shift completely. He knew helping her would bring consequences from his own world, consequences far heavier than ignored phone calls or missed meetings. He felt that weight, but didn't turn from it. Something had begun inside him, a mission stronger than caution or reputation, and he knew he was stepping into a fight he couldn't avoid. As she disappeared into the back room, he felt the quiet settle around him like a challenge waiting to be answered, a signal that what came next would change more than just her life. Ethan walked into the boardroom with a calm he didn't fully feel, carrying the weight of his new decision like a warm stone in his pocket. The room was cold in every sense, from the polished table that reflected strict lines to the distant skyline behind the glass that made the whole city look unreachable. He took his seat and faced the people who had shaped his world for years. For a moment he thought of Mia's soft laugh, the way she tried to hide her tired eyes with a smile, and that memory gave him enough strength to breathe steady as he opened the folder in front of him. He didn't dress up the idea or try to soften the message. He told them plainly he wanted to create a grant program for workers like her, a program that helped people who carried heavy loads and quiet dreams, people who kept the world moving without ever being seen. The words came out steady, shaped by everything he felt outside that diner when his heart cracked open for the first time in years. The reaction hit him fast. The board didn't exchange polite glances or measured breaths the way they did during financial updates. They leaned forward with alarm, voices rising with arguments that sounded rehearsed. They called his idea reckless, irresponsible, a sentimental distraction that could damage their bottom line. Some reminded him of stockholders, others brought up expansion plans, all circling around the same point. Helping people who didn't affect the company's numbers wasn't smart business. Ethan listened, letting each word hit him, but refusing to let any of them shake the truth inside him. He realized how much of his life had been guided by these same kinds of fears, by numbers and approvals, and the pressure to maintain a perfect image. He felt the old him tug at the edges of his mind, the part that used to agree with every risk report and every cautious step. But then he pictured Mia wiping down tables long after her shift should have ended, pictured the strength she carried without complaint, and the old voice faded like a shadow in sunlight. One of the board members stood and spoke in a tone that barely hid frustration. He accused Ethan of acting on emotion instead of logic, and warned that if he continued down this path, they would have no choice but to consider a vote to remove him from leadership. The words carried weight, but not the kind they expected. Instead of fear, Ethan felt a strange sense of clarity, as if everything he'd done until this moment had been leading him here. He looked around the room at faces that had shaped his life for so long, and understood that none of them knew who he was outside of numbers and growth charts. None of them saw the boy he once was, the boy who used to believe helping people mattered before he learned how heavy power could be. The silence grew thick as he closed the folder and folded his hands, taking a slow breath before speaking again. He told them he wasn't acting on impulse. He said he'd spent years building something huge and impressive, something that made headlines, but never made him feel alive. He said he had watched someone with nothing give more kindness than he'd felt in decades, and realized he had been measuring the wrong kind of wealth. A few board members stiffened at the mention of kindness, as if the word didn't belong in the room. Others softened just slightly, uncomfortable but listening. He explained that the documentary he abandoned had felt empty because it was meant to show people something he didn't even believe in anymore. Instead, he had seen a truth that changed him. He wanted an empire that helped people grow, not one that only protected itself. Some board members argued again, trying to pull him back with familiar fears, but Ethan had already crossed the line. He told them calmly that he wouldn't back down, no matter what it cost. The room fell into stunned stillness. A few whispered to each other, a few glared. One leaned back with a quiet sigh, as if realizing something big had just shifted forever. Ethan felt his heart steady, not racing the way it used to during tense meetings. He wasn't performing or defending numbers. He was standing for something alive, something human, something that reminded him of the warmth inside a small diner that had already changed him. As he walked out of the boardroom, the hallway felt colder than before, but his steps carried a new weight, one that didn't drag him down. He knew what he'd started wasn't simple, and he knew the board wouldn't let it go easily. Their anger would follow him, their threats would grow stronger, and the cost would be heavier than anything he'd risked before. But he also knew he wasn't alone in this. The memory of Mia's quiet strength followed him like a guiding light, reminding him why this mattered, and why walking away from the old version of himself was the only path forward. He paused at the window at the end of the hallway and looked out at the city that once felt like his kingdom. Now it felt like something he needed to rebuild, piece by piece, starting with the people who had been invisible for too long. He took a slow breath, knowing one last step still waited, the one that would seal this choice not just for him but for everyone who depended on the empire he was willing to reshape. Ethan's penthouse felt larger than ever that night, but instead of comfort, the space carried a cold silence that clung to him the moment he stepped inside. He dropped his keys on the counter and stood there for a long time, staring at nothing while the city lights flickered through the tall windows like distant stars he could never reach. He replayed Mia saying, "Friend," again and again, letting the softness of that word echo through the empty rooms until it felt louder than the threats from the board. That single word had cracked him open, and now there was no way to seal it back. He walked slowly through the living room, running his hand along the back of the couch, feeling memories of board meetings and long nights working without ever asking himself why. He had spent years thinking power would keep him safe, that if he stayed untouchable, no one could hurt him. Tonight he realized that the walls he built around himself didn't keep pain away, they kept life away. That fear of being vulnerable had shaped every choice he made, and now he was standing in the middle of the life it created, a life that felt hollow in ways he could no longer ignore. He sat on the edge of his bed, burying his face in his hands, as the truth hit harder than anything the board had said. He wasn't scared of being voted out. He wasn't scared of losing status or influence. What terrified him was the idea of going back to the man he was before he stepped into that diner, the man who felt nothing and noticed no one. The thought of losing this new sense of meaning, this new purpose rising inside him, made his chest ache. He closed his eyes and saw Mia's tired smile again, the way she pushed through long days while still offering warmth to people she didn't know. She lived on the edge of exhaustion, but still managed to make him feel seen. She had nothing and still gave more than anyone in his world of luxury and spotless offices. The difference between them made him see the truth he'd been avoiding. His life wasn't built on strength. It was built on fear. Fear of failure, fear of emotion, fear of letting anyone close enough to matter. That fear had kept him rich in money but poor in meaning. The longer he sat there, the more he understood that he couldn't go back, not even if the entire board turned against him. He felt something settle inside him, slow but firm, like the ground shifting under his feet and finally finding balance. He stood and walked to the window, pressing his hand against the cold glass as he stared at the city below. He whispered to himself that helping her was worth whatever he lost, because losing the empire wouldn't destroy him the way losing this new sense of purpose would. The choice became clear, not because it was easy, but because it was finally honest. He wanted an empire with heart, not walls. He wanted to build something real, something that reached people like Mia, instead of pretending to understand them from a distance. The board could take his title, his office, even his reputation, but they couldn't take the truth he learned sitting in that diner booth. He felt the crisis inside him break open and settle into clarity. He straightened his shoulders and walked across the room with a steady breath, knowing tomorrow he would face the board not as the old version of himself, but as the man this journey had forced him to become. He was choosing purpose over power, and that choice carried weight that filled him with fear and relief all at once. He knew there would be consequences, heavy ones, but he also knew he could carry them now. Something inside him had grown stronger than fear. He sat down again, calmer than before, and let the silence fill the room in a new way, no longer cold but waiting. Moments like this make people stop and ask themselves what they would do in his place, whether they would hold on to the life they built or risk everything for something that finally feels true. Stories like this remind us how much courage it takes to change and how rare it is to find meaning in unexpected places. If you're feeling that too, pause for a moment, share your thoughts in the comments, and make sure you're following the channel so you don't miss how this journey unfolds. These stories keep growing because you're here walking through them with us. As Ethan lay back and closed his eyes, the last thought that drifted through him was simple but powerful. Tomorrow he would face the people who shaped his old world, and he would choose the new one anyway. His whole life was about to change, and for the first time that felt right. Ethan woke before sunrise with a steady breath he didn't feel the night before, as if choosing purpose over power had settled something deep inside him, even though everything around him remained uncertain. He dressed without rushing, grabbed his coat and stepped into the quiet hallway outside his penthouse with a sense of finality pressing at his ribs. The city looked still from the elevator window, but the boardroom he was headed toward waited like a storm he couldn't avoid. By the time he walked through the office lobby, the usual greetings from staff felt different. They weren't afraid, but they were curious. Sensing something unusual in his calm stride, Ethan didn't stop to explain. He had already made his choice in the silence of his penthouse the night before, and now he carried it forward with the courage he'd fought hard to find inside himself. When he pushed open the boardroom door, the air shifted instantly. The long table was already filled faces tight with concern and calculation. They expected him to bend, to retreat, to come to his senses and drop the grant idea that threatened the order they had maintained for so long. He didn't sit at first. He stood at the end of the table, hands resting lightly on the chair, and said with a calm voice that he was launching the program no matter what they decided. A few members exchanged looks, while others leaned back as if bracing for impact. Ethan finally took his seat and met every gaze without flinching. He felt fear pulsing under his calm tone, but for the first time he understood fear didn't mean he was weak. It meant he cared enough to risk something. That realization grounded him just enough to speak clearly, explaining that the grant program would support workers like Mia, people who kept their communities alive while carrying dreams they never got the chance to chase. His words didn't come from a polished speech. They came from the truth sitting heavy in his chest. The reaction was swift. One member leaned forward, speaking sharply, asking if Ethan understood the financial impact of such a program. Another warned him that philanthropic ventures without clear public payoff could damage their reputation. A third reminded him they had legal obligations to shareholders, not to random workers in diners. Ethan listened as their voices rose, as fear disguised as logic tried to corner him. They brought out documents citing clauses that aimed to trap him in old systems he no longer believed in. They tried to scare him with reminders of what he could lose, painting worst-case scenarios like shadows crawling across the polished table. For a moment, Ethan felt a familiar pressure in his chest, a whisper of the version of himself who had always backed down to avoid conflict. But then he thought of Mia telling him people like her didn't get more, and that memory cut through every argument the board threw at him. He leaned forward, fingers clasped, and said he understood the risk better than they did. He told them he knew how the numbers looked, how the press might react, how shareholders might doubt the move. But he also knew what the company had done for years with philanthropic funds that never reached the people they claimed to help. Those missing details, those quiet reallocations, those funds buried inside marketing budgets or redirected to projects that never made a difference. He had stayed silent for too long about them. Now he watched the board flinch as he named those truths without raising his voice. He could see the tension ripple across their faces, fear mixing with anger in ways they couldn't hide. They knew he was right. They also knew exposing those truths would put them at risk. That realization changed the room. The board's tone shifted from firm resistance to frantic calculation. They asked him what he intended to do with those revelations. They warned him speaking openly about those funds could trigger investigations and shake the company at its core. Ethan didn't hesitate. He told them he was prepared to clean up every inch of the empire he built, even if it meant tearing down parts that were rotting from the inside. Their disbelief spread through the room like a cold wind, and several members tried to push back with desperation in their voices. They thought he was bluffing. He wasn't. The decision had already taken root the moment he realized meaning mattered more than control. And this is the moment where anyone listening has to wonder something real. If you were standing in his place, knowing the truth could cost you everything, would you expose it or walk away and keep your life the same? These choices shape people, and sharing your thoughts in the comments helps us keep stories like this alive. What do you think Ethan should do next? Ethan rose from his chair slowly, letting silence settle on the table like a weight none of them could lift. He looked around the room and said he was done pretending that protecting numbers mattered more than protecting lives. He told them that if they wanted to vote him out, they were free to try, but they needed to understand something. He would take the truth with him if they did. That truth hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. A few board members whispered among themselves, realizing the situation had slipped into territory none of them wanted to navigate. He walked toward the door with steady steps, feeling fear humming under his skin, but also feeling stronger than he ever had in that room. He paused with his hand on the handle and looked back once more, telling them that the grant program would launch, and that this was their chance to stand on the right side of something bigger than profit. The room stayed silent, the kind of silence that holds the beginning of something huge. He stepped into the hallway, letting out a long breath as determination settled fully inside him. Whatever came next would shake the empire he built, but for the first time in his life he felt ready for the fallout. The old version of himself wouldn't have survived this moment. The new one was born from it. Ethan left the boardroom, knowing something irreversible had begun, and by the time he reached his office, his phone was already buzzing with messages he didn't bother opening. He stood by the window for a long moment, letting the city settle into focus. The fear from earlier still pulsed inside him, but something steadier rose beside it. a kind of quiet fire that reminded him why he made this choice in the first place. He called his communications director and asked for a press conference within the hour. The man hesitated, saying the board hadn't approved anything, but Ethan cut through with a calm tone that left no room for debate. This was happening, and the world needed to hear it from him directly. As he hung up, he saw his reflection against the glass, and for the first time he didn't see a man hiding behind success. He saw someone stepping into truth, even if it cost him everything. When the cameras lit the room and reporters filled the small stage, Ethan walked up with a steady breath. The murmurs quieted as soon as he reached the podium. No flashy introduction, no corporate lines. He went straight into what the board feared most: honesty. He spoke about the grant program for service workers, why it mattered, and how he no longer wanted a company that protected profit more than people. Then he went further, revealing the hidden misuse of philanthropic funds, the redirection of money meant for communities into polished marketing strategies that helped no one. He didn't raise his voice, didn't accuse with anger. He simply laid out the truth with the calm weight of someone who had finally stopped running from himself. Gasps filled the room. Cameras flashed. Reporters scrambled for questions. Ethan knew there was no turning back now. Within minutes, the story exploded online, sweeping across every platform. News stations interrupted their broadcasts to cover the unexpected confession from one of the country's most influential CEOs. Comment sections filled with shock, arguments, support, disbelief. Some people were angry at the corruption, others were moved by his honesty. But most were stunned that a man with that much to lose had chosen to speak with such naked clarity. Ethan watched some of the coverage from his office, hands shaking just slightly. He felt fear, yes, but also a deep sense of relief he never expected. For the first time in his life, he wasn't protecting an image, he was protecting the truth. As the hours passed, shareholders began weighing in. Surprisingly, many supported him, saying they respected his integrity and the future he was trying to build. A few members even stated publicly that the board should back the grant program instead of fighting it. The balance of power shifted faster than the board expected, their leverage slipping through their fingers as people across the country rallied behind Ethan's vision. His phone lit up with missed calls from board members trying to control the damage, but he let them ring. He had said what needed to be said, and the world was listening. The company's stock wavered for a moment, then steadied, as public confidence rose in response to his transparency. Meanwhile, in a small diner miles away, Mia stood frozen in front of the mounted television above the counter. The lunch crowd had quieted as the news anchor repeated Ethan's words, and she stared at the screen in disbelief. She had known he was carrying something heavy, but she never imagined he would upend his entire company for people like her. Her hands trembled as she leaned on the counter, trying to make sense of the man she thought she had understood. A mix of pride and worry filled her chest. She wasn't afraid for herself. She was afraid for him. She whispered his name under her breath, barely audible, as if trying to send strength through the screen. Moments like that create a strange kind of unity. People in different homes, different cities, alone or surrounded, all feeling the same sharp pull in their chest as they watch someone stand up against a system bigger than themselves. These moments remind everyone that courage has a way of stirring hearts in places far from the stage where it happens. Someone in a diner, someone on a bus, someone sitting quietly after a long day, all of them sharing the same breath, the same mix of worry and admiration, even if they never meet. Back in his office, Ethan finally stepped away from the screen and walked toward his desk as messages from reporters and shareholders poured in. He didn't answer any of them. Instead, he pulled up the draft of the grant program and read it again, making small notes, small changes that reflected the promise he felt growing stronger inside him. He thought about Mia seeing the broadcasts, wondering what she must be feeling, hoping she understood why he did it. The city outside glowed brighter as evening approached, as if the world itself was shifting into something new. He felt the weight of the battle still ahead, but also the pride of someone who had finally found the courage to stand in the light without hiding behind numbers or strategy. As the news cycle continued, the board tried to regain control by releasing statements questioning his stability, but the public didn't buy it. Too many people related to the pain he had described. Too many workers saw themselves in his story and in the dreams his grants could revive. Shareholders slowly began to side with him, realizing that an honest leader was worth far more than a silent one. The old machine was cracking, one public truth at a time, And Ethan knew this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over, but the ground had shifted in his favor, and the power that once felt like a cage now felt like a tool he could reshape. Yet even as things started turning his way, one thought stayed sharp in his mind. He understood the world saw him differently now, but he still hadn't talked to the one person who pushed him into this transformation. He felt a quiet ache at the thought of facing her again, unsure of what she'd think of all this. The city lights flickered across his office floor as the next big decision waited just ahead, calling him forward into a future he knew he couldn't face alone. Ethan didn't wait for the news cycle to cool down, or for the board to steady themselves. The moment the sky turned the soft grey of early morning, he drove straight to the diner with a tight mix of nerves and hope twisting in his chest. He parked in the same spot as before and sat for a moment with both hands gripping the wheel, preparing himself for a conversation that meant more than any meeting he had ever attended. The diner lights glowed warm against the cool morning air, and through the window he saw Mia moving between tables, calmer than she had looked on the newscast, but still carrying uncertainty in her shoulders. He stepped out of the car, heart pounding, and walked toward the door, seeing her pause when she noticed him. She didn't smile at first. She just stared, trying to understand why the man on the news was standing here like nothing had changed. He walked up to her booth slowly, feeling every breath in his chest. She asked why he came back, her voice low and cautious, as if she wasn't sure whether she was allowed to be upset or proud or scared. He sat across from her and took a quiet moment before speaking. He told her everything. Who he really was, what happened with the board, why he exposed the truth, why he couldn't pretend anymore. She listened without interrupting, hands folded tightly, her eyes searching his face for any piece of the man she thought she knew. When he explained the grant program, the one meant for workers like her expression softened, but also filled with shock. She whispered his name, almost afraid to believe him. He told her the part that mattered most. It would start with her, not because he pitied her, but because she deserved the chance to follow the dream she buried to take care of others. Mia covered her mouth with her hand and shook her head, overwhelmed. She told him she wasn't special, that she didn't do anything remarkable, that she only worked hard and did what she had to do. Ethan leaned forward and gently reminded her of every small moment he had watched, her kindness, her strength, the way she talked about helping kids who felt left behind, the way she carried her family without bitterness. She said people like her weren't meant to get opportunities like this, and he felt those words like a knife all over again. He didn't argue. He just repeated that she deserved it, not because of luck or charity, but because she had a dream worth fighting for. She looked away, trying to hide the tears building at the corners of her eyes. She asked what people would say, what the world would think, what would happen if she failed. Ethan told her she didn't have to prove anything to him or anyone else. She only had to be willing to take the step. She stayed silent for a moment, wiping under her eyes, trying to breathe steady. It wasn't pride stopping her. It was the quiet fear of someone who had never been given a chance and didn't know how it felt to be chosen for something that could change everything. When she finally looked at him again, her voice cracked as she said she didn't feel worthy of someone believing in her that much. Ethan reached across the table, keeping his voice gentle, and said she already taught him more than she knew. She showed him what real strength looked like, and this program wasn't about saving her. It was about honoring the truth she had helped him see. Later, when she would look back on this moment, she would realize it wasn't just about the offer. It was about the shift happening around both of them, the kind that only hits harder as the story moves forward. Choices like this don't stay quiet. They grow and echo and change everything in ways no one can predict. When she finally whispered that she didn't know how to accept something like this, Ethan told her she didn't need to know, she only needed to say yes, and the rest would come step by step. Her shoulders trembled as she looked down at her hands, remembering every moment she had felt small, forgotten, or stuck. Then slowly, like someone opening a door that had been shut for years, she nodded. It wasn't a bold, confident nod. It was a fragile one, full of fear and hope fighting inside her, but it was enough. Her tears fell freely then, and she covered her face as everything she had carried alone for so long finally cracked open. Ethan moved to the other side of the booth and sat beside her, not touching her but staying close enough for her to feel supported. She apologized for crying, and he told her not to. He said tears were not weakness, but proof that something important was happening. She asked why he cared so much, and he answered honestly that she helped him find a part of himself he thought he lost. She shook her head again, still trying to take it all in, still fighting the feeling that life wasn't supposed to give her this kind of moment. But the more she breathed, the more her heart settled into the truth. This was real, and she was allowed to step into a future she once thought belonged to someone else. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes red and shining, she asked what happened next. Ethan exhaled with a quiet smile and said this was the beginning of something bigger than both of them. She could go back to school, help kids like she always wanted, rebuild the dream she once offered to the world before she had to give it up. She let out a shaky laugh that sounded like relief mixed with disbelief. He felt a warmth fill his chest, a warmth he hadn't known in years. Something inside him clicked into place. His vision wasn't just a plan anymore. It was real, alive and standing right beside him. As the morning crowd grew around them and the diner filled with everyday noise, neither of them noticed. They were wrapped in something quiet but powerful, something that felt like healing. Ethan knew the final challenges still waited ahead, that facing the board again would be a battle. But sitting there with Mia, seeing her accept the first piece of her future, he felt the world tilt toward hope. And for the first time since this journey began, he believed they might actually win. Ethan woke the next morning with a calm he hadn't felt in years, a kind of quiet that didn't come from success or victory, but from finally stepping into the life he had been avoiding. The city outside his window looked different, softer somehow, as if the world had shifted just a few inches overnight. He knew the board was still reeling, still trying to steady themselves against the truth he had exposed, but that weight no longer sat on his shoulders the same way. Today was about building something new. He arrived at the office hours before anyone else, walking through empty halls that once made him feel powerful, and now only reminded him of everything he almost sacrificed. The air smelled of polished floors and stale coffee, but beneath it he sensed something alive, something growing. He pulled up the files for the new grant program, reviewing every detail with steady hands. No staged photos, no fake partnerships, no press spins. Every dollar would be traced, every report public, every decision transparent. The empire he had built would finally serve the people it pretended to support. The team that arrived later wasn't the same group who watched him from a distance. Some employees approached with hesitant smiles, thanking him quietly for the press conference, saying they felt proud to work for the company for the first time in a long while. He felt a lump form in his throat at their words. For so long he thought leadership meant being untouched, unreachable, a figure above everyone rather than among them. Now he saw how wrong he had been. He gathered the executives who were willing to meet and laid out the new structure for Ward Industries. No more hidden budgets, no more polished lies, no more decisions made from fear. He talked about fairness and purpose, about giving workers a path to grow, about building something steady and honest. The room stayed quiet, but not the kind of silence that fights back. It was the silence of people trying to understand a man they thought they already knew. In the days that followed, the company shifted around him like a living thing shedding an old skin. Departments that once dealt in flashy campaigns were redirected into real outreach. Managers met with teams to identify workers who needed support, whether through grants, new training programs, or pathways that gave them a chance they'd never had. Ethan walked through the offices in a way he never did before, stopping to listen, shaking hands, asking questions that mattered. He listened to a janitor talk about working 2 jobs and dreaming of running his own cleaning service. He listened to a receptionist explain she wanted to be a photographer someday. He walked away from those conversations, carrying their stories the way Mia carried hers, with a sense of responsibility that felt grounded instead of heavy. Meanwhile, Mia prepared for her teaching program with a mix of fear and excitement that shimmered through her every step. She went shopping for notebooks and pens like a kid on the first day of school, laughing at how strange it felt to buy things for herself instead of her family. Her sister helped her sort through online classes, and her father insisted on taking a picture of her studying, even though she blushed and told him not to. The diner staff teased her gently, telling her she'd be the only future teacher who still knew how to balance 6 plates at once. Every moment pulled her deeper into the truth that her life was finally changing. She carried the grant letter in her apron pocket, reading it during slow hours, as if making sure it was still real. And every time she looked at Ethan's signature at the bottom, her chest warmed with a gratitude so strong she didn't have words for it. For Ethan, the transformation of the company wasn't the only change happening. His understanding of himself shifted too. He realized why Mia's kindness had hit him so hard. It wasn't just a kind word from someone who didn't know who he was. It was the honesty behind it, the way she treated him like a person instead of a title. No one in his world had talked to him that way in decades. That moment reminded him of who he used to be, before ambition swallowed everything else. Her simple gesture had become the spark that burned through years of fear, pushing him into a life built on meaning rather than image. He understood now why he had stayed at the diner that day, why he kept returning, why her story mattered to him. She showed him the kind of strength that couldn't be measured in numbers. She reminded him that vulnerability wasn't weakness, but the first step toward real connection. The more the company transformed, the lighter Ethan felt. He no longer rushed through his days with a tight jaw and restless mind. He walked slower, breathed deeper, laughed more easily. He found himself leaving the office without the old sense of duty clinging to his back. He visited the diner, not because he needed answers, but because he wanted to be part of the world he had ignored for too long. Mia joked with him again, but her eyes held a different kind of warmth now, one that came from trust rather than uncertainty. They talked about her classes, her fears, her hopes, and Ethan felt a steady pride rise in him each time she spoke with more confidence. Her growth felt like proof that his new path was real, that the empire he once feared losing was becoming something worth keeping. Ward Industries made headlines again, but this time the tone was different. Articles praised the transparency, the community programs, the bold shift in leadership. Workers spoke publicly about the changes and how they felt valued for the first time. Investors who once doubted Ethan now backed him, seeing the company's growth not as a financial spike, but as a cultural turning point. The board had no choice but to follow the new direction. They still watched him closely, but they no longer held the power to stop him. The foundation of the empire had changed. The center of gravity had moved from fear to purpose, and Ethan felt it in every decision he made. One afternoon, as he stood in his office watching the city glow gold under the setting sun, Ethan felt something he didn't recognize at first. It wasn't relief or victory, it was peace. A deep, quiet peace that stretched through his whole body and settled into the place where fear used to live. He knew the journey wasn't over, that there were challenges ahead and compromises to make, but he also knew who he had become. He was no longer the man hiding behind numbers. He was someone building a world where kindness mattered, where possibilities were real, where people like Mia didn't have to choose between survival and dreams. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the sunset rest on his face, and understood with full clarity why everything had happened the way it did. Mia's kindness didn't just touch him, it woke him, and waking up had changed everything. As the last of the sunlight faded from the window, he felt the next step calling to him, soft but certain, leading him toward the final moment waiting just ahead. Ethan arrived early, long before the sun had pushed its full light through the school windows. The hallway buzzed softly, with the kind of morning sounds that carried hope in every echo. He walked slowly, taking in the drawings taped to the walls, the backpacks dropped outside classrooms, the smell of pencils and warm air drifting from vents. This wasn't one of his offices. It wasn't one of his buildings. It wasn't built on glass or steel. Yet somehow it felt more important than any tower he had ever owned. At the end of the hall was the room where Mia would teach her very first class. His steps slowed as he reached the door, not because he doubted her, but because he knew what this moment meant for both of them. He peeked through the small window in the door and saw her inside, arranging chairs and writing her name on the board with a nervous but excited smile. She wore a simple outfit, nothing flashy, just something comfortable that let her move around the room easily. He felt his chest warm at the sight. He stepped inside quietly, not wanting to interrupt her rhythm. She turned, surprised, her eyes widening with a mixture of disbelief and joy. "You came," she whispered, as if speaking too loud might break the moment. Ethan nodded, feeling his throat tighten. He told her he wouldn't miss this day for anything, that watching her step into her dream mattered more to him than any meeting, any vote, any headline. She looked around at the empty room, laughing softly as she said she still couldn't believe it was real. She touched the desks gently, as if they could disappear if she wasn't careful. He told her it was real because she made it real, because she had the courage to say yes to something she once thought belonged to other people. She shook her head, smiling with the same gentle warmth she gave him months ago when she placed a plate in front of him and called him friend without knowing the power that word carried. They talked only for a few minutes, both knowing she needed space to breathe before the students arrived. When she asked if he wanted to stay for the class, he hesitated, but she insisted with a shy smile that said she wanted him there. even if just for the first few moments. He took a seat in the back.